Next we have the well-known environmentalist, Ashish Kothari. Ashish Kothari is an Indian environmentalist working on development, environment interface, biodiversity policy, and alternatives. He's one of the founders of Kalpavriksh, a non-profit organization in India which deals with environmental and development issues. He has been associated with people's movements like the Narmada Bachao Andolan and Beach Bachao Andolan. Ashish has also been a teacher of environment at Indian Institute of Public Administration, IIPA, New Delhi. I welcome on stage Ashish Kothari. Ashish will be speaking about two sides of a coin, animal rights and environmental justice.
I got interested in animal rights issues. That we did was to approach the then Prime Minister Morarji Desai about continuing the ban on export of rhesus monkeys to the US. He had stopped it. Before that, for many years, India was exporting rhesus monkeys for all kinds of horrible experimentation. And he stopped it, but there was a lot of pressure on him to reopen it. And we, 4 or 5 of us from school, went to him. In those days, it was much easier to meet the Prime Minister. We went and approached him and said, "Sir, you did a good thing. Please don't buckle under the pressure." And he didn't. We still have the ban. Unfortunately, of course, the trade shifted to Bangladesh. It also takes me back to another thing that happened 40 years back when about 15 of us stood outside the gates of the Saudi Arabian embassy because the Saudi Arabian princes had been given permission by the Indian government to come and hunt great Indian bustards and floricans, threatened species. So we stood there outside the gates and shouted things like, "Eat custard, not bustard," and so on and so forth. And again, it was much easier those days to get press publicity than it is now. So 15 of us made headlines, and the next day the government politely requested these princes to go back. So I very much take Purva's message and support it in saying that a few individuals can also make a huge difference. We then shifted to looking at what was happening in I was growing up in New Delhi. It was getting to be a more and more horrible city. The big forest in New Delhi the Ridge Forest was being destroyed for all kinds of purposes, construction, highways, and so on. And we used to enjoy ourselves going there. So we took up this campaign to protect the Delhi Ridge Forest. And if you go to Delhi and the central parts of Delhi, you'll still see 7,000 hectares of forest, one of the world's largest city forests, partly as a result of the kind of actions that we took. Shortly after that, moving into college, we heard about the Chipko movement, so we did 2 long treks through the Garhwal Hills, understanding what the Chipko movement was about, trying to understand the perspectives of the women who were leading those movements. And then in 1983, walking along the entire stretch of the Narmada River to try and figure out what would happen if the big dams that were being proposed on that river would come up, what would happen to the environment, to people, and so on. And what all of these first few years of my journey did to me and to a number of my colleagues in Kalpavriksh and other organizations was to bring us the sense that even as we focus on animal rights and wildlife conservation, we can't lose sight of the fact that these are intricately connected to social, economic, political, cultural issues. That you can't just be talking about trees and tigers and dogs and cats and so on, but you also need to be talking about issues of human rights, issues of development, issues of politics, issues of structures of power, and I'll keep talking about the structures of power as I go along, issues of inequalities, and so on and so forth. So that's the first few years of the journey. And based on that, and then the next 35 years of what some of us have been trying to do, I'd like to take up 5 critical issues today, and hopefully leave enough time for some discussion. I will follow the time-honored tradition of my predecessors and go over time. And I'm sorry that's going to cut a bit into your lunch, but that's okay. We can sacrifice a little bit of our food security for the sake of a good discussion. The first issue is wildlife conservation. In 1981, we did an investigation in what was a very horrific incident of police firing on graziers, on villagers who moved into the Bharatpur National Park, bird sanctuary which many of you may have gone to in Rajasthan. And they went in because they had been grazing, they had had their buffaloes grazing there for a long, long time. And suddenly overnight it was shut and they were told that they can't come in anymore. They forced their way in, they were pursued and shot at, and 7 people were killed by the police, who said birds are more important than you folks. Now, what that brought to us was this whole issue of what is wildlife conservation. Can we actually have a Western model of wildlife conservation in a country like India, where people are so heavily dependent on forests and other natural ecosystems? The whole model of conservation, wildlife conservation in India and elsewhere in the world has been exclusionary. It's been about saying, okay, save wildlife, but keep people out. Whereas in fact, in the last 10, 15, 20 years, we've seen globally shifts taking place which are saying that, look, not only is that a violation of human rights and cultural rights and so on, but in fact, it doesn't work for wildlife also. Because you're just creating more and more and more enemies who at some point or the other will hit back, or who at least will not be your supporters in conservation, whether it's tiger or elephants or whatever it is. We've had global shifts in these paradigms towards much more collaborative management, towards much more inclusive conservation, towards much more community-based approaches, towards a combination of saying, of course, the wildlife needs its space, but also people have to be there to be able to protect that space, and their livelihood interests are also important. Unfortunately, in India, we still see a very colonial approach. So we still see somebody sitting in New Delhi or Mumbai or wherever saying, oh, we need tigers there, move 30 villages out. Or as in the previous example, lions, so move 100 and something villages out. We never say we need conservation in the Delhi Ridge Forest, which used to have leopards. So can we please move the President of India out? Or the army, which currently is sitting bang in the middle of the Ridge Forest? No. Villagers, shift them out. Their lives are less important. Us, no way. Don't touch our lives. And I'll come back to this issue in a minute. The second issue, which is, I think, very thorny but needs to be confronted, is the issue, and I think you all saw a short clip yesterday which has brought this up, of vegetarianism and animal rights, and I'm into both of them, so please don't get me wrong, versus human rights. I'm just talking about fundamental human rights. I completely go with the argument that we need animal rights and vegetarianism for ethical reasons, for ecological reasons, for health reasons, the 3 reasons that our morning speaker also spoke eloquently about. But when animal rights become, and this is especially the case with industrial meat production, industrial fisheries, and so on. But when animal rights becomes an excuse for divisive politics, for excluding certain communities because we want a Hindu Rashtra or whatever it is, for targeting in particular Dalits and Muslims, for a brand of cow vigilantism which doesn't care 2 hoots about social justice issues, and when we, sitting in this room, do not speak up against that, then we're actually party to a politics of hatred. And it's a politics of hatred that will consume all of us, whatever we are, wherever we are, at some point or the other. And here I think we need to confront the structures of power. As I said, I'll keep talking about structures of power because I think we need fundamental challenges to those. In this case, the structure of power of statism, that is where a state is deciding on conservation or on what it is to be talking about animal rights and animal welfare, or class, elitism. Let's look at this room. How many Dalits here? Not a single one. How many Adivasis? Not a single one. That's 2/5 or 3/5 of India's population missing. How many animals? Non-human? Not a single one, because we do these things in places where you can't actually have animals walking around. So we are actually also practicing a form of exclusionism which we are otherwise outside here deriding or criticizing. Let's take the third issue. And by the way, structures of power that I was mentioning also talk about communalism, casteism, etc., etc. There's all different sorts of complex structures of inequality and power that we have in India and elsewhere in the world, which need to be at least recognized, if not confronted. The third issue is another very thorny one, which is animal rights versus wildlife conservation. In Ladakh, we've had incidences of dogs, domestic dogs, preying on the black-necked crane, one of the most endangered species in the world. We've had complaints of wildlife being hunted down by domestic dogs in northern Sikkim. It's a common phenomenon taking place in many parts of the world. Or we have the issue of some species of birds, like pigeons and crows, becoming so numerous that they're actually pushing out other species of birds, including those that might be threatened. But as animal rights activists, we have this hesitation of taking some action because we're going to be influencing or possibly threatening or possibly harming some individual animals. And I know it's a very difficult issue. For me also it's a very difficult issue. For all of us it is. I think what this represents is another structure of power, which is an extreme form of individualism. That we think of the individual animal as being more important than the species. And so no action is taken against stray dogs in Ladakh or stray dogs in, I'm sorry to use the word stray, I don't like it, but dogs that are not being cared of by somebody in northern Sikkim and so on. And I think this is also something that we need to talk about. The fourth issue, animals as persons. This is a subject that Varda and I have been having some correspondence about. Now I understand that the term person or personhood is not necessarily about human beings, but 90% of the world will think of it like that. When you say animals as persons, they will say, okay, animals are similar to human beings. Now, why should a respect for an animal, or a plant for that matter, depend on how similar they are to us? Should that respect not be there regardless? Just because the cockroach doesn't behave like us, should it not be respected? I think we need to ask ourselves some really hard questions. We sometimes fall into these traps for strategic reasons, and I can understand them. But we fall into these traps of thinking of how do you protect the great apes or the elephant or dogs or cats because they are somewhat similar, because they have empathy, because they have consciousness, because they have kindness, etc., and therefore they're like us, but then we can't argue that for an earthworm. And I think there's something seriously problematic there also. And in a sense, it actually, even as we extend these ideas of compassion to the rest of the animal kingdom, or some of the rest of the animal kingdom, we display a certain form of anthropocentrism still, when we talk about rights as a personhood. Now, we've had a number of legal movements towards recognizing the rights of animals and the rights of rivers and the rights of mountains and largely the rights of nature. Many constitutional amendments, many laws, just as Radhakrishnan mentioned one or two, there are many, many others. The Uttarakhand High Court has come up with judgments on the rights of Ganga and Yamuna, and recently the rights of animals. And I think this is a fantastic first step, that we begin to recognize in our jurisprudence, in our laws, in our constitutions, in our formal structures, that there is an extension of human rights also to non-human animals or to the rest of nature. But I think that's only a first step. We need to go well beyond that and say that law cannot be the only tool for this. We need to actually say that we have to go beyond that into talking about basic respect, basic mutualism, basic coexistence. And look, for instance, at indigenous peoples who've had that concept for millennia. They don't have laws talking about the rights of nature, but there is an inherent respect for the rest of nature, which comes out in many different ways. And I would argue, at the risk of maybe getting beaten up at lunchtime, that indigenous peoples who still hunt for their food, but respect nature in these fundamental ways and protect their forests and surroundings in these fundamental ways, are better animal protectors than most of us sitting in this room. And why is that the case? I'll come to what I think is my most important point, which is that unless we confront our current model of development, which gives us this kind of a room, we're all doomed. We're talking about a form of development that is anti-nature, anti-humans, anti-animals, in very fundamental ways. Here's an advertisement from about 25 or 30 years back of an Indian multinational corporation. I think no ad agency, oh, I'm sorry. No ad agency would probably put out an ad like this anymore because they'll know it's politically inappropriate. But the model of development is still very much this. It says, all over the world, nature's mighty barriers separate oil, gas, minerals from their destination. So nature is a barrier, okay? Only a handful of international giants can bridge these gaps. One of them is Indian, Dotsal, ripping through jungles in Indonesia, moving the earth in India, laying pipelines. So if we want development, we've got to shove nature aside. The only thing that's missing in this ad, because I guess at that time, even at that time it would have been politically inappropriate, is a whole set of Adivasis and forest dwellers falling off that forest. But they also suffer the same displacement consequences. How is this important for us? Number one, I think we need to understand and challenge the fact that we have this growth fetish, the economic growth fetish which underlies this model of development. We want 6%, 7%, 8% growth. India is very proud of the fact that it is currently the second fastest growing economy in the world. That this growth fetish is essentially unsustainable. It is essentially a violence to the earth. It is something which will constantly increase materials and energy flows which the earth cannot sustain. We are already at 1.5 times what the earth can sustain. We simply cannot continue developing in this manner anymore. But the second important reason that I think this is important is because all of us are complicit. Our consumption patterns. I'm amazed at our blindness. We say veganism, we become vegan, but we live lifestyles where somewhere somebody is doing mining of a forest for us. Let's take this building. In my room, I noticed that these guys here are very proud of the fact that they're eco-friendly. Nice organic soap, etc., etc., etc. Every hotel in the world now says, you want to be water friendly, don't put your towel for washing, reuse it. Great, fantastic. All of this we need to do. But where does this marble come from? Where's this granite come from? Where's the wood that goes into the ceiling come from? It has come from ecosystems which have been destroyed, and there are animals there which have also been destroyed. So this blindness that we have is something we have to confront internally. Our community has to confront this blindness. All of us here on our tables have bottled water. Bottled water is a form of violence. How many of us carry our own bottle of water? How many people in this room? Fantastic, 20, 30 of you. Why not everybody? Why do we give in to the incredible profit-making and wasteful industry that is the bottled water industry today? We all know what happens to these bottles. Even cows eat them sometimes, or at least eat the broken down remains. We are told in trains to crush them and put them, so you crush them and put them, and of course animals are also going to eat them because they don't have anything else to eat. But we're not mindful of that. So I think as animal rights activists and as wildlife conservationists, these issues really need our attention. They need to be confronted. They need to be challenged. And I therefore move into what I think is the good news. The first one of which is that I think the Earth's biggest protectors are, again, not the people sitting in this room. Maybe some of us, yes. But they are the ones who are putting their lives in the line of fire by defending rivers. This is from 30 years back, a movement that stopped 2 big hydroelectricity projects coming up in central India, which would have drowned 300 villages and drowned 1/3 of the Indravati Tiger Reserve. They stopped those projects. Every day, one of these environmental defenders is being killed somewhere in the world, putting his or her life in the line of fire. These are defenders. How many of us actually are either part of or support these movements, which are today labeled as fantastic? Many of you. Norma, of course, she's constantly in the courts defending them. But when they're called urban Naxals, when we are called urban Naxals, or when we are called anti-national and anti-development, how many of us actually stand up and be heard saying no? If they are urban Naxals, so are we. The Me Too movement is fantastic exactly for this reason. But we need a Me Too urban Naxal movement also, which tells the government that just because we dissent from government policies, just because we stand in the line of what they call development, we are not an extremist. In fact, if anything, you are an extremist because you are destroying the earth. This is what we need. But we also have other kinds of earth defenders, which are people who are actually experimenting with some of the most amazing alternative, constructive initiatives on water, on food, on energy, on governance, on gender, on health, on education, on sexuality, on all kinds of stuff. And I'm glad Pura mentioned a few of those, for instance, in our presentation when she gave examples of how an individual can make a difference. These are all movements in one way or the other for environmental justice and nature's rights, in one way or the other. When, for instance, the Dalit woman farmer in Telangana does dryland farming on a small piece of land to feed her family of 10 people with no pesticides, no chemical fertilizers, no GMOs, no hybrid seeds, she's an earth defender. Because those of us, how many of us sitting here today are wearing organic cotton? Has any of us asked? Justice spoke about culture. We think of culture where we want to wear three-piece suits. We don't look at where our clothes are coming from, what kind of damage they're causing to animals because pesticides are being used to produce them. So that's all part of the movement, the animal rights movement. We need to expand our horizons to all of this and take into account and support these fantastic initiatives. There's thousands of them happening around the world. And from this sort of a different model of well-being, not the current model of development, but a different model of human well-being which encompasses all these issues emerges and is increasingly being spoken about in the world. We've called it radical ecological democracy or eco-Swaraj in India. In different parts of the world, they call it different things. But there are 5 crucial elements here, and then I'll end with a couple of more slides. One, radical democracy, which means wherever we are part of decision making. We don't leave it to politicians and bureaucrats. In our mohalla, in our village, in our organization, how many of us have organizations in which there are hierarchies? Or, okay, how many of us are in organizations in which there's complete flatness, no hierarchy, no directors, no presidents, no nothing, everybody is an equal member? 2, 3, 4. Why do we accept hierarchies in our organizations? Why, if we don't accept it outside? So radical democracy, which means we're all part of decision-making processes. That is democracy, right? Demos and cracy is ruled by the people, not ruled by people who we elect once in 5 years. Second, economic democracy. That Dalit woman farmer is saying that if food is the issue, I want food Swaraj, Anna Swaraj, food sovereignty. I don't want government to be providing me food. Of course, it should be accountable for that. But I want the capacity and the conditions by which I can produce my own food and feed my family. And to build relations with those who respect what I'm doing, rather than go to a shopping mall and buy the food there. Okay? We want economic democracy, localization. How much can we actually create local areas of self-sufficiency where, at least for basic needs, we're able to meet these needs and don't need bottled water, for instance, coming from outside. Culture and social justice. We already spoke about gender, about caste, about class, and so on and so forth. The struggles for Me Too and so on, these struggles are also part of that alternative narrative. Cultural diversity. I'm sorry, and I'm saying this very openly, a Hindu Rashtra is not cultural diversity. Cultural diversity is about recognizing the fact that we have 780 living languages in India, 780 living languages. Each of these languages is a library of knowledge. When we teach in our schools in one language, Hindi or Marathi or whatever it is, we erase those hundreds of languages and all the knowledge that goes with it, which is so crucial for our ecological sustainability and human existence. And of course, none of this would exist were it not for ecology itself being protected. Let me ask you a simple question here, which I ask in schools. And so far I've had a very interesting response rate. Where does the most important thing in our life come from? That is something we can't live for more than 2 minutes. That's oxygen, right? Where does it come from? Plants, too vague. Go specific. Trees? No. Amazon? No. Leaves? Too vague. The sea? Go further. Right. Marine algae produce 70% of the Earth's oxygen. So far, the correct response rate that I've got in schools and colleges and meetings like this is about 2 or 3%. The most important thing in our life, and actually our education system doesn't even tell us where it comes from. So ecology obviously is absolutely crucial thing as part of this. At the core of this flower of transformation and alternatives is a set of values. And I think that's something that we've all been talking about. Everybody's been mentioning compassion, for instance. So I'm just setting out a few of them. There's no time right now to go into all of these. But these are things that I've learned from the different experiences on the ground that people have been trying out, where they say that, no, it's not competition, it's cooperation that works, where they say it's not just rights, but it's also responsibilities, where they say that physical labor is as important as mental and intellectual labor, where they say that sitting in this kind of a atmosphere and talking about animal rights is a contradiction. We need to move towards more simpler lives. I haven't done that myself. I mean, I live a lot of contradictions, so I'm admitting that openly, and I think that's something that we need to really confront collectively and individually. So it's this fundamental set of principles, ethics, values, which will inform us in our daily lives and our collective lives and in transforming the models of development that we otherwise are suffering from. So to end, what I think we need is an alliance, a dialogue and an alliance of movements which cut across these different areas of justice. Justice for animals and others and the rest of nature, justice for people, especially those who are currently disprivileged and marginalized and exploited. Pro-democracy in very fundamental ways. Pro-peace in many fundamental ways. We should be part of the anti-war movements, for instance, across the world, or in central India, where there's an open war for the last 40 years. And an alliance that speaks truth to power, whether that power is masculinity, patriarchy, state domination, capitalism, racism, casteism, speciesism, whatever isms that form these concentrations and inequalities of power. One very small attempt that we're trying to do for this, and I'd welcome all of you to join, is what we call the Vikalp Sangam. A Sangam in India has always been a sacred space of rivers. This is a Sangam of ideas and practices where people who are doing these kind of wonderful alternative things come together, share experiences, build further collaborations, and collectively challenge the structures of inequality and power that I've been talking about. And out of this has also arisen a website where there's already 1,000 such stories of positive, constructive change. If any of you is ever feeling depressed in life, please go to this website. You'll cheer up because there's a lot of great stuff happening, even though, of course, we know that there's immense amounts of suffering and pain and destruction that is taking place around us. It's these symbols of hope, practices of hope that we need to be able to nurture, support, build, further network, and take it further in our lives, whether we are animal rights activists or human rights activists or whatever kind of work we do for justice. Thank you.
If anybody wants to, yeah, please.
You mentioned an
You can
instance
identify
of.
your name while you speak.
My
sir.
name is Giselle Mehta, and I'm an individual who's both into rescue as well as veganism. You mentioned an instance where there's an intra-animal conflict, the dogs versus the wildlife. But equally, our compassion also has an ecological fallout. A very good example would be the hurricane that ripped through North Carolina. And in the process, a lot of pigs which are being farmed, they died. and the whole state was inundated, the rivers were inundated with pig manure. So those who were concerned with the fate of the animals were equally anguished with the pollution that happened of the waterways. So I do think that compassion does have a corresponding ecological fallout, so we can always think in integrated terms. Then the second could be, again, it's an American example, where the wild horses and various other wildlife, the coyotes, the wolves, they're being pushed out of their natural environments to make way for cattle ranches. So our compassion for the animals affected in factory farming equally has a wildlife fallout. And the third point I want to make is that global warming is largely prompted by the animal farming industry. So that's something that doesn't just involve India and its habitats, but the whole world, because we are hit by the hurricanes and the storms and whatever else, the natural phenomena that are really hitting us with huge intensity. So it's time to think beyond just our country and the forests, but into something cosmic, because there are no borders. Everything is porous. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Or not stewarded the earth. Global warming is, of course, a classic example of that. So I agree with you. I mean, but some of these are, of course, very difficult, tricky issues. So if one wants to release animals from industrial scale production and have them free roaming, then do we have the political will and the wherewithal to say that let's do this by shrinking our cities and giving space in our cities? We don't unfortunately have that. So that's why, unfortunately, it's the wilderness that goes, and you still continue that conflict. So I think we need to actually create that kind of political will to fundamentally challenge the structures that are forcing us into these very difficult trade-offs, which we don't want. So we have to be able to challenge those structures itself. So I'm in agreement with you. I'm just going further and saying that how do we deal with that is by actually building a narrative for a completely different model of well-being, which is not what we have been following so far in the name of development.
Hi Ashish, Anand is my name. You spoke about development at any cost is not what we want to be standing up for, right? I'm just putting up two important cases that are running right now, and I'm part of both of them. One is the RA forest in Mumbai, and the other one is the latest order by the CM of Uttar Pradesh to knock down those 50,000 trees across the Terai region, right?
Yeah.
Now, what is the argument that the government is putting up in the case? Both the cases saying, if you need metro trains, allow me to cut down these, 3,000 acres in Mumbai, as against 55,000 trees across 3 tiger reserves in Uttar Pradesh, right? Do you have any specific instance, an example of how cutting down that need for development has been addressed? Now, if you go and stand in front of the Chief Minister Yogi Adityanath and say, you don't want that 4-lane road to become 8-lane, what is the alternative? And how do we counter that? And if there's anything that you have as a specific, I mean, I would like to connect with you after this because I think there is a lot more we must do. But is there anything that we must know of how we stop development without making it look like anti-development?
Yeah, so I think one has to, Anand, go a little bit deeper into whether it's the roads that we need, or it's movement that we need, or it's commuting that we need, or it's livelihoods that are supposed to be improved because of the commuting that we need, etc., right? Unfortunately, with development, because it's just economic growth kind of thing, we never go deeper into why we need a particular, infrastructure, in this case, let's say roads. Now, that of course in a short term kind of thing is very difficult to address. But let us say, why do we need a 8-lane instead of a 4-lane kind of thing? They'll say, so you can go faster from one place to the other, or because traffic is increasing, or whatever it is. You go deeper and say, okay, suppose we're able to actually build a efficient public transportation system which reduces the number of vehicles on the road. This is an argument we've been giving in cities all the time, right? When we try and fight against flyovers and things like that. If it's livelihoods that is an issue, are we able to create dignified, adequate livelihoods in both these places so that people actually don't have to move these long distances? And there are now hundreds of examples of villages that have so revitalized their economies that people are actually moving back to the village. They don't have to be moving to the city and back and forth all the time. So really, what is it that we are trying to address by making this infrastructure? One would have to go a little bit deeper. And the hope would be that you'd get somebody like Justice Radhakrishnan there who might be able to willing to take the time to actually go a little bit deeper and understand that. Unfortunately, of course, I know that neither government nor our courts have that kind of patience, let's say, with these deeper arguments. But this is why it's a long-term fight. This is not going to be solved. Short of that, do we have enough people to sit there and say, sorry, we're going to block the road construction?
Yeah,
This is how those projects have been stopped.
Sure. So just in the case of UP, it's this, right? When we went and met, I went and met Mr. Kedari, who is the chief secretary there.
Yeah.
And the point he made was that the attempt of the road is to increase it to a 8-lane road because traffic is expected to go up 4x in 20 years.
Yeah.
Right? So we are looking at development that is so much more forecast for 20 years. So it's going to be extremely difficult countering this unless we really have something that's even
No, but
more
Anand, this is why I'm saying that, look, it's the same with energy, right? We're saying that in 10 years, 20 years, we're going to have this much energy demand, therefore we need 20 more nuclear power stations, 20 more coal-fired power stations, etc., etc. And this is where we need to be able to argue to say, let's look at the demand itself. How much energy do we need for what and for whom? I mean, do we need these sorts of buildings where we have incredible amounts of air conditioning? I'm freezing right now. So we have to be able to go deeper. Does a chief minister or a judge have the patience and the time to do that? I don't know, but this is what I'm saying. This is a long-term phenomenon. Short of that, it has to be just blocking. We just have to say, I'm sorry, but this is not acceptable. If you're not willing to listen to some of these deeper arguments, we're just going to block the road. That's if we have the people power to do it, of course, or whether you have the legal power to do it. 20 years later, traffic, yes, but that's based on business as usual, which is more and more private cars, etc., 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 which we've seen everywhere, right? 20 years later, on a different model of transportation, we may not have that much more traffic. Exactly with energy, exactly with water, which is why fundamental questions have to be asked.
Ashish, I'm Anand Grover. I noticed you said that capitalism is one of the issues that you want to tackle. Are you opposing it? And if so, what is wrong with capitalism according to you? And what is the alternative? And let me say that I agree with what you're saying, but there is a vagueness in your notion, which I have not captured, that capitalism is something you oppose, and what do you mean by it, and what is the alternative? Because let me just add one thing. As opposed to that, socialism, as you know, has failed economically as a framework. So that's the framework of my question.
I'd need an hour more to be able to address this. So I'm sorry for the vagueness, but I mean, given the lack of time, it's not. Yeah, but I mean, it's a very, very vital question and not an easy one to answer. I think we need to be able to work these things out. But basically, just in very brief, when I say capitalism, I'm talking about structures of power where the private sector has so much power over our lives that we are not able to control even basic economic functions, right? And where, in fact, profit making is creating the kind of inequalities that, for instance, Purva spoke about earlier, or even in India, 5% of India earning 95% of its wealth. So it seems to me that these kind of class disparities, which are only increasing because of the structures that we have, is what we need to confront. So yes, basically I am opposing capitalism, but I am also opposing state socialism, by the way. Because what's been happening in the name of socialism, whether it's Soviet Russia or whatever it is also completely, to my mind, unacceptable. Yeah, I know you agree, so I'm just, maybe for the rest. So what is the alternative to that is what, if one looks at, for instance, the examples of radical democracy, it's neither state-led nor capital corporation-led, it's actually community-led. And by community, you can mean a whole different set of things, right? So it's where people are saying that we are the ones who are in control of the economy and of political decision-making, of money, etc., etc. And there are now so many examples of how this is possible and where it's been made possible, that I think it's a matter of being able to learn from that and say, okay, how do we scale that out to make it more widespread and to be able to challenge the structures of whether it's state socialism or capitalism or patriarchy or whatever it is. But let's have a longer conversation on what this would mean.
Hi, sir. Hi, sir. My name is Altaf, and I'm like, can we call a person an animal rights activist if that person is not an environmentalist? In a way that if someone harms the environment, that person is harming all living beings on earth. So are they not harming the animals as well if they are not environmentalist?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that was partly the kind of message I was on, is not enough. If we are a vegan and we live in a 5-star kind of environment, then it's a contradiction. So if you're trying to become a minimalist, congratulations, that's fantastic. Please give us examples of how you've done it, so that the rest of us can also follow. Because a lot of us actually don't necessarily, even though we believe in it, we don't necessarily follow it because we don't think it's convenient enough, or we don't know what the options are, etc., etc. So the more we can spread examples of how we can live simpler lives, whether in a city or wherever.
I have stopped buying things that I don't need. I've stopped buying clothes.
Exactly.
Like,
So, and we have, I mean, for instance, Goa, there's a new shop. Norma, I'm sure you know about these 2 young people who set up this shop, which is a totally waste-free shop. No plastics, no nothing. You go with your own barni, your vessel, and you refill the dal or the chawal or whatever you want. So there are more examples like this which are coming up. But we really need stories. Please give me your story. We'll put it up on the Vikalp Sangam website so other people will read about it and learn how to become simpler, lead simpler lives.
Hi Ashish, my name is Anmol. Yeah, I know my question might be rhetorical.
But we really need stories. We will put it up on the Vikalp Sangam website and learn how to become simpler, lead simpler lives.
Hi Ashish, my name is Anmol. Yeah, I know my question might
Succeed always. I try and ask myself what action I'm taking and what would be its impact. I do this with school kids also, for instance. We look at the dustbin that they've used in that day and what all has gone into it, and then we say through the day what all products have we used, where has it come from, where is it going, etc., etc. You know, the whole life cycle kind of thing. It's a very interesting exercise to do. One tries to do it oneself. In Kalpavresh, we're beginning to decide, can we do an ecological footprint of the organization and each one of us individually, and then say, okay, by next year we try and reduce it by 10% or whatever it is. We haven't done it yet. We're still talking about it. So it seems to me that as an environmental activist or a social activist or whatever, these fundamental challenges to oneself and one's organizations and one's friends and family have to be done. Where it helps is because as individuals, it's not so easy for, let me give you a simple example. I cycle from home to work and back 15 kilometers every day, okay? But I'm in Pune, which is becoming as horrendous as Delhi and Bangalore in terms of pollution and traffic. So my heart is in my mouth every time I cycle back and forth, right? But I still do it, and I wear a mask. I don't know how useful it is or not. But I can't expect everybody else in Pune to do that, especially kids who should be cycling to school, but they don't because their parents won't allow it for justifiable reasons. The only way that will change is a social movement which will argue for cycle paths, for safer cycling conditions, for less pollution, etc., etc. So there are some things one can do as an individual, and there's a whole lot more that can be done as collectives, which is why we become organizations or try and network and create those social changes also.
Stan? Sir,
Yes.
there's a mention of can animal rights activists, should they be doing more? I do believe they should be doing more, and it's just a genuine request. I'm carrying my own bottle, and I carry this bottle everywhere that I go, and I see a lot of plastic, and every time I see these plastic bottles, single-use bottles, my heart comes to my mouth all the time, whether I fly, whether I go anywhere. So it's a request, at least in this gathering, we can try and reduce the amount of plastic that we are using. Just reuse these bottles that you've just opened. Just ask the hotel guys to fill it up again and give it. In fact, in my hotel room, I asked for a bucket also. So if you can skip the shower, go with the bucket thing also, that's great. So just to highlight that. Thank you.
Thank you. Next FIAPO conference, no bottled water. Varda? Yes.
Hi, my name is Sukanya. I am a psychologist by profession. I think I just want to add to the ongoing discussion on what activism is about, whether that be about social activism or animal activism. I think the basic premise of activism is that we need to wake up. We can't be passive anymore. Whether that be what we are doing to the environment, the earth, or to fellow human beings. And that's very important because majority of the earth's population now is programmed to be passive, to lead their lives in a passive existence without asking basic existential questions. And I think one of the ways in which activists, whatever sphere we may be working in, can be doing is to work up our way, to educate the children so that they are the future citizens of tomorrow. And so if we actually program them to not be passive anymore, to actually wake up to what's the real truth behind capitalism or the environmental abuse that's happening, that's one way of ensuring that the future will be something that we are trying to program right now. We may not be able to see that future, but it's important that we leave that behind with the future.
Thank you, Sukanya. Just in their own innate compassion and creativity and innovation, all of which is destroyed by our schools today, to work with that and see how each one of us can become a more responsible human being as we grow up. Yes.
A little off the beaten track, but in your opinion or in your experience, have you come across any genuinely authentic green enterprise which is actually sustainable and has a healthy ROI? And is this something that we can aspire to, people who are in the business of innovation and invention? And is this something that is honestly sustainable, or is it just going to be, it's like a tokenism that will happen for a short while and then die out? Or is it something truly sustainable for a period of a decade, 2 decades, maybe even 3 decades?
Yeah, there's lots of examples of of producer companies. Because I want to put 2 things on the table here. One is 3 things. You said ROI, so that's the economics of it. Genuinely sustainable, green, etc. So that's the ecological part, but I also want to put democracy in here. Okay, because if one is talking about the fact that you have a company which may fulfill the first 2 but where one guy is making off with all the profits, then that's also a problem. Yes, so there are lots across the world, including in India, of producer companies where workers are kind of running the company in a democratic way, and they're making fairly good, not profits, but revenues, which then go back into the lives of the workers or back into the production facility, etc. I mean, a couple of years back, I know many in India producer companies, pharma producer companies, fish, I shouldn't be talking about fish here, but okay, fisher producer companies, milk producer companies, etc. Sorry, milk again is a problem. Anyway, or small scale manufacturing producer companies, which are running like this. They take a few years to take off, and in those few years they need some support, like capital kind of thing, which then, so they have friends of circles. Like I can tell you about Dharani, farmer producer company in Andhra Pradesh, run by this thing called Timbuktu Collective, which is now broken even and is actually making revenues. So yes, there are, or last 2 years back I was in Greece in a place called Thessaloniki, where workers had taken over a chemical detergent factory and had completely converted it to olive oil based cleaning agents. Okay, it's completely eco-friendly and run totally democratically. Every worker gets the same wage regardless of what they are doing per hour. So yes, there are examples of that. But if we think that today's big capitalist organizations, companies can become like this, no, unless the owner is willing to give over the entire production facility to the workers. So this greening of capitalism kind of stuff that's happening, to my mind, is hogwash.
Yeah, I'm a theoretical physicist, so I'm going to go into the thought realm, and I want to get your opinion on it.
Ouch.
Just building off what my colleague said over there, I'm a bit curious because the way I'm viewing it right now is I don't think there is any such thing as activism per se. I think there's just thought and rational thought and trying to solve a problem. And I was just curious what your opinion of that was. In terms of basically the lack of thought that's exhibited in modern society, at least what I'm seeing in the West, for example. You went into the education system. That's something I'm quite passionate about. It's, as Albert Einstein said, if you expect a fish to climb a tree, he's going to go his whole life believing he's stupid. So I was just wondering how you could, what would your opinion on that topic be?
Not sure the story of this on the Vikalp Sangam website. There's a school, a learning center called Adharshila in Madhya Pradesh, run by two people in an Adivasi community. And their school model is completely different. It is actually about, like I said earlier, about encouraging the innate abilities of the children, about encouraging their own cultural roots, but also bringing influences and things from outside, about working with the children to create their own curriculum, and so on and so forth. And to my mind, this is something that actually is building on and further influencing thought processes of those children and of the teachers. They don't call themselves teachers, but the people who are supporting this, in ways that will create a very different human being. And to my mind, that's activism. So, and there's lots of that. I can give you hundreds of examples of that happening, where thought, action, or as Gandhi said, the head, the heart, and the hands and feet, I guess, are put together in a learning environment rather than what we have today, where it's like only the head.
But see, the thing is, then that leads me to question if humanism, as you were elaborating on, what if humanism itself becomes a doctrine? Then see, you got to be very careful, because we see activism in this light of, right now it's a solution to a problem. But if you imagine a utopia where activism itself is the norm, then how do you?
Okay. Yeah. No, I think if you're saying that any kind of ism runs the danger of becoming dogmatic, I agree with you.
Exactly.
And which is why I think that slide I have of values is possibly the most important one. Forget about the isms. It's what are the fundamental ethics of our life. If we go with that, then to my mind, you can call your ideology whatever ism, but it's those fundamental things that I think are important.
I see. So it's basically to try to free from conditioning and allow natural development.
Yeah, well, except the word natural itself comes into problems, but yeah.
But okay.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Darshana. So I'm going to ask you two questions, and the second question is going to depend on the first one. So I'd like to know if you're vegan or not first, and then I'll ask you the second question.
Not yet.
Not
Vegetarian,
yet.
yes, but not yet vegan, but I've been cutting down, yes.
Okay. What is it that made you go vegan?
I haven't yet, but wanting
No,
to.
wanting to?
For the same reasons that have been given here, that if I can actually reduce my impacts, whether it's environment or it's violence, etc., then I would like to. I'm not yet sure that I can, for many different reasons, which I'm not going to go into, but I'm trying. So those are the reasons.
Okay.
Those are the reasons I went vegetarian in the first place, and then,
So what I find very strange is that nobody talks about the UN report, which was out in 2006. It's a 400-page UN report called Livestock's Long Shadow. Nobody talks about the environmental impact of animal agriculture or the use of animals on the environment. Why is that? Because in the environmental circles, this is like literally just hidden away. And this is like in 2006.
yeah,
It's not
actually
even
it's
something-
come back in a big way now because of climate crisis, as I think somebody else earlier mentioned also. The industrial livestock, the livestock industry across the world is definitely substantially it's not, I don't think it's a predominant one, but it's a substantial contributor to the climate crisis. And so in fact, this issue has come back in a big way in environmental circles, not just animal rights, but in environmental circles. I know that when the UN came out with this report, it wasn't really given the kind of attention that it needed, but now I think it is coming back, and it's time. And so yes, we should raise that, definitely. The only thing is, and again I would say, going back to what I was saying earlier, is that we should not, we have to raise these issues, but let's not let them become an excuse for, like I said, the politics of hatred and so on and so forth. So I mean, we just have to be a little careful about that.
So then wouldn't that really convince you to go vegan?
No, I'm convinced. I'm just saying that there are certain reasons why I've not been able to do it, which I can tell you over lunch if you want, but.
Yeah, I would love to know. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Hi, Ashish. In a sustainable development, my PhD is going in sustainable development. So if you see the India country, the chronic capitalism is one of the concern. Okay, the corporates are so powerful that they control more than 90% of our revenues and the growth. And government also, they have a direct control. And if you see these small initiatives, this is a very niche, less than 1 or 2%. So how would you see as a policy changes which is happening, and what you would suggest? Because I think eminent members here and policy members are one of the group which can influence the policy makers.
Yeah.
So how do you say, what are your views which will drive the future?
So I think, okay, my long-term, that's a long-term struggle that we have to wage. In the shorter term period, if you're talking about policy changes, let me give you one simple example. 200 million people in India are dependent even now on handicrafts. Okay, handmade items, not dependent for use, I'm talking about livelihoods, jobs. And yet, most government policy is about how do you set up large-scale industrial productions for cloth, for footwear, for anything that we use in our daily lives, all of which can be produced in the handmade industry. Let's argue for a policy shift to go there. Now, when GST happened, for instance, people had to be, handloom weavers and others had to be sitting out on the streets and saying, you can GST all you want, the big industry. Why are you GSTing us? We're already marginalized, as in the handloom industry, right? So, we have to support those kind of movements, and we have to say that, okay, and we have to support it also with our personal choices. How many of us are actually wearing handmade? How many of us have relationships with organizations? There's a fantastic handmade stuff being produced. The only places I can see this, and you can see the impact of the policy changes, I'm going to finish, yeah, last one, is for instance in Kerala, where the Kerala government has supported this big network of women producers called Kudumbashri, and Kudumbashri now does footwear, it does clothes, it's different kinds of things. That kind of policy support would actually shift this sector in a very big way. The same thing, and the last example I'll give is 80,000 crores of rupees in chemical fertilizer subsidy right now, 80,000 crores. Shift it over the next 5 years into organic, everybody in India, all farmers will shift into organic. Thank you. I think we're out of time, so thanks a lot.
Thank you, Ashish, for the wonderful presentation, showing us a mirror and the inner contradictions that are there. I'd like to request Varda, token of our appreciation, which I'm sure you'll say should have been emailed to you. Thank you.